And we're live.
This is Plant Daddy Podcast, serving you intersectional horticulture. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Steven.
Hello, welcome back to Plant Daddy Podcast. Today, we are going to give a very simple primer on a group of plants that are defined more by their growth and structures than by any sort of taxonomic categories. We're going to talk about succulents.
So, Matthew, when you say a succulent, what plant do you picture?
Okay, so for me, I always picture cacti and all of those little rosette-forming things that come in all these powdery shades of greens, blues, reds. Burrow's tail, aloe, kind of anything that's, thick and fleshy.
Yeah.
There's a whole section of them at every garden center.
Yeah, for me, I was going to say something fleshy, odd structures that are sort of bigger and sturdier, maybe.
Like
than
more cartoonish.
Grasses. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to them.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to succulents in a moment. But how are you doing, Steven? What's going on with you?
I'm doing pretty well. Today I was repotting some things, of course. My favorite pastime.
Steven repots his plants every morning when he wakes up.
Yeah, so this is...
all of them.
Yes. So this is a little bit kind of unlike me, I'd say. Like, I typically look for strange things or stuff I've never seen before, and I'll get plants like that. But I came across a deep red version of Mother of Thousands. So I potted that up, and I'm really hoping this little plantlet takes off. I will share hundreds of thousands of plantlets with you if I ever get them.
Yeah, I can't imagine that this isn't going to be a plant that'll survive, because it actually is a succulent, and it's one that has a really cool propagation technique. It grows little baby plants along the leaf serration, and then each of these fall off and produce a new plant, even if it's just sitting on the floor of your apartment.
It could be sitting, in a, sopping wet jug of water in the dark, anything. It typically survives. So I'm really putting myself out there, admitting that I have this and that it hasn't taken off yet. And if it dies, well, I'll probably be fired from this whole project.
Yeah, I can't have Steven as my co-host if he can't keep a Mother of Thousands alive.
I couldn't do that with any dignity either.
Cool.
So how about you, Matthew?
It was a typical Monday. Not much going on. It's a beautiful day, but I feel like fall is coming.
Really?
Like, the leaves at the bus stop that I took on my way back from work, they were already falling off. And that might actually be more because of low water than seasonal difference.
I'm just they're so tired of summer. They're just summered out, but they're not.
I just don't like seeing a lot of dead leaves on the sidewalk when it's still August.
I don't like thinking about summer ending.
No, I'd like it to stay summer forever, because all my plants love summer. But I have no plant updates to share, really. I've done a lot of repotting and repositioning of things, but everything's pretty stable right now. I'm feeling good.
That's good.
Yeah. So unless there's anything else, before we dive into our topic, I just want to remind everyone that we can be found online at Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest as Plant Daddy Podcast, and online at plantdaddypodcast.com. You can also contact us by email at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com. We would love it if you could please rate and subscribe to help others find us and to just kind of make this whole thing a little bit more visible to people looking for gay-themed plant podcasts.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's shared it already.
Yeah, we really appreciate that. All right, anything else before we dive into succulents?
I just wanted to kind of frame this one a little bit. So we were thinking about this episode and all the things we could say about succulents, and we wanted to offer something a bit different than just the typical how-to episode or,
I mean, you're going to find that in, any plant podcast.
Yeah, or, it could happen, really, you can find it in any, online search result maybe, right?
Yeah.
But we thought we would dig into something a little bit different, something we run into in plant circles sometimes, which is, what is a succulent actually? What does it include? What does it mean? What can it mean to different growers, probably most importantly? And what is it that's interesting to think about or at least be aware of? So this could lead you to other plants similar to ones you grow now, could just make you aware of certain things that might be related, that may be easy, to just kind of add to your collection, or, just a new way to think about some of these. Or it could just be, something to ponder as you pass the, 500 odd succulents you probably pass by in any given day at this point.
Yeah, like they're pretty much everywhere. And this kind of is a good point following our last episodes where we talked about some Pinterest lists that we did recently. You might find a lot of resources that talk about like how to grow succulents, but they're really talking about a very limited group within what constitutes a succulent. So that's why we want to dig in a little bit more about the what is a succulent portion. Mm-hmm. So I always start in science. That's kind of my way of learning about a new plant or a group of plants. I first research it in the context of like evolution, its relation to plant families, the global distribution it has, characteristics and unique attributes, and all those other fascinating like background bits. So, as is pretty widely known, succulents are plants that are able to store water and nutrients for use during periods with inconsistent water exposure. But the reason we started this episode by asking each other what kinds of plants we think when we think succulents is because succulent plants include far more species than the ones that we would just kind of classically consider succulents. Horticulturally, there's not a family of succulents. In terms of the growers, some can consider any desert plant that a collector of succulent plants wants to grow, they might just consider all of those succulents. So in its broadest definition, a succulent plant is any plant with some of its parts modified to be thick or fleshy, and this is to retain water in arid climates. These anatomical storage units, basically, may be the leaves or stems, and some consider a plant succulent if they similarly use the roots and underground structures for storage of water and nutrients. Since this is a really inclusive definition, it would also include any plant that forms bulbs, tubers, corms, rhizomes, anything that can be used to store resources.
Okay, so Matthew, what's a corm?
A corm, it is, I actually don't have like a science answer to this. I believe it's a portion of stem. And so a lot of plants that you call bulbs, like crocus or crocosmia, these are corms. They're not the same structure as a tuber. I think they might be a little bit more fibrous, but it's not a bulb because bulbs have layers of swollen leaf that provide that that substance.
Okay, so I just Googled this. It's a rounded underground storage organ of a swollen stem base covered with scale leaves.
Yeah,
okay,
there we go.
I learned something.
Yeah, there we go. So, that could be considered a succulent, like in some definitions, but this is a very broad, non-taxonomic group of plants. So even for hobbyists and experts who don't include the underground structures in their definition of succulents, it's common to include caudex plants. And this is kind of funny to me because their swollen structure that is used for storage, it's usually formed from above ground roots or the roots and stem combined. So, you can grow a plant that would typically have that underground raised up in a pot to form a caudex instead of having it as an underground fleshy root. It really depends on how you personally, as the grower of the plant, wants to categorize it. A lot of people consider caudex plants succulents, but that might not be in line with everyone's definition, and it might also be a little bit hypocritical depending on how you yourself classify them. So this is something that it is loose, it is not well defined, but it doesn't really impact your own experience of growing, like what the words we use.
Or maybe it's like if you hear succulent, if you use the word succulent, I mean, it's so broad that I don't think you have to worry necessarily about, only referring to a certain set, being wrong.
Yeah.
That it's not included. I think it's kind of a big tent term.
I don't think that anybody's going to get on your case if you refer to a yucca as a succulent, because we'll actually talk about some plants that are kind of like that later on. It's really a big family of non-related plants that are united by these conditions. And because of how useful this adaptation is, it's pretty broad. But for the purpose of this episode, we're going to stick to the more classic definitions of succulents. and treat geophytes, which are those plants with the underground storage bodies. We're going to treat those separately and not talk about them. A lot of them have herbaceous growth and are distinct enough from the classic succulents that use stem and leaf modification for storage that we're only going to focus on kind of these non-geophyte succulents. A term that is used to describe succulents and a lot of other desert plants is xerophyte. These are plants that are adapted to environments with very little water, whether it's hot or cold, because, you know, a cold area can have very limited rain as well. Now, not all xerophytes are succulents. A lot of them tend to be, but there's also some that have seasonal leaves that are far more delicate and only suitable for wet seasons, and then they become deciduous. So some xerophytes are succulents, not all succulents are xerophytes, and vice versa.
Okay, but most people, the ones, again, this is a lot of like most cases, largely, most people think kind of stuff. But
yeah, and it doesn't really matter for what we're talking about.
But mostly the classic succulents that you see around would be considered xerophytes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So succulent plants can be found on all of the non-Antarctica continents and throughout many ecosystems from mountains to deserts to jungles to shorelines. But perhaps surprisingly, they are not very diverse in the world's driest areas, like Australia, which actually I think is the driest continent, like, out of all of them. It has very few native species of succulents. And even in Africa, which happens to have the most native succulent species, there are very few in its driest areas. And this is because succulents do best where they can count on water, even if it is really scant. So some of them may live for up to 2 years without getting any rain, but a lot of them are not going to be able to depend just indefinitely with no moisture, which is true of all plants, of course, but succulents and xerophytes in general tend to be a lot more flexible in how often they receive it.
So wait, that means there are no plants in those areas?
Or if there are...
Which plants are there?
Well, yeah, there are far fewer plants in the absolute driest areas, but the ones that you'll see tend to be trees that are able to grow really long, deep taproots that can reach underground aquifers and water
that makes
sources.
sense, actually.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there are actually quite a lot of succulents, though, that grow outside of kind of this context that we assume. There are some that grow in tropical areas with regular water, and there's also a lot that come from cold environments. Like, you'll go up to the mountains in the Pacific Northwest, and you'll actually find quite a lot of sedum species. They're totally fine with low temperatures and with low access to water, but they're also fine if they get a lot of it all at once, because that's sort of how they've been designed. They grow either terrestrially in the ground, or as lithophytes on rocks, or epiphytes on trees. Did you know that there's even an aquatic species of succulent plant?
No.
It is Crassula helmsii. It's related to the jade plant that a lot of people are familiar with.
Okay,
And it
I
actually,
have to Google this right now.
Yeah, Crassula helmsii. It's kind of neat because you don't think of succulents as being under the water plants. So there's also a gradation of succulents. Some plants that are succulent have thick, fleshy leaves, while others are only slightly thicker than your typical herbaceous plant. And the succulent parts of a plant might be tough and waxy with an impervious outer cuticle, or they could be soft, tender, and easily damaged. Some succulents have no leaves. Most cacti have actually had their leaves modified into spines, and some other species and genera, particularly for the succulents in the Euphorbia genus, have succulent stems, but herbaceous, often deciduous leaves. So,
So yeah, the succulent part, it could be in the stem, or it could be in the leaf, or it could be in both.
yeah.
Right.
And some plants are like completely round because of how succulent the leaves are, and others might just be like slightly thicker than you would usually find.
Yeah.
Like Hoyas are sometimes considered succulent because they have...
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, and sometimes the with cacti, right? They've just devoted all that energy to hurting you. Well, not that energy, but
Yeah.
like, you know, the leaves are just weapons now.
Yeah, it's, well, because in those areas water is scarce, and if you are looking for water, the plants that live in that area trying to store the water are your source for it. So the spines are a defensive mechanism. Now, some of the features that are common among succulents are a reduced number of stomata, which are the little holes that are used for respiration in the leaves. The stems are often adapted for photosynthesis because, like we just said, many of them have fewer or no leaves, so the stem has to pull that photosynthetic weight. Then there's also physical shapes that maximize volume while reducing surface area. So the rounder something is, the more internal space there is for the surface area. So that's why a lot of small cactus in particular are very round. A lot of succulents have almost round leaves. There's also some interesting stuff to allow for like the shape change of a cactus. The ribs along the outside mean that it can swell to a greater volume when water becomes available. And these ribs are usually where you'll find the spines, so it's like a good combination of like adaptability for resource management and also for protection.
And, you know, I think this kind of plays into something we've talked about recently, too, which is expressive plants, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is kind of how they're able to do that, at least some of them, because, like, speaking very loosely.
Yeah,
right?
There are quite a few cactus that your useful guide for watering are, does it look round and plump? Then don't water it. Is it shrunken with pronounced ribs? It's time to water it. So that is a really useful technique for a plant that grows quite slowly and doesn't have the ability to be really dramatic with its, you know, soft tropical foliage to just go suddenly limp. The cactus will just slowly become more deeply ribbed. Now, they also tend to have shallow roots because, like we said about the trees that survive in the driest climates that cactus and other succulents tend not to, those deep roots give them access to water. But if you're in a desert trying to survive on moisture that comes in the form of dew, it's really useful to have shallow roots because if there's not enough water to permeate deep down into the substrate, it helps to have all of your roots close to the surface where the water is most available. They're also pretty resistant to high temperatures, and they're able to continue with their photosynthesis and just kind of all of the biological mechanics at temperatures that are higher than a lot of other plants are able to, because they're evolved for it. And then they also use something really cool called crassulacean acid metabolism. It's also known as CAM.
Okay, interesting. So tell me about CAM.
It is a really cool mechanism that, coupled with reduced stoma, minimizes water loss. So for plants that use CAM, the stomata remain closed throughout the day when the sun is up in order to reduce the evapotranspiration or water lost through breathing. During the night, however, they open to take in carbon dioxide, which is then stored in the cells as malic acid. Then the next day, during daylight hours, the plant uses this malic acid to aid in photosynthesis because it's not taking in carbon dioxide when the sunlight is present.
Okay.
And they need both of those components simultaneously.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, all right, it can open up at night, get the CO2 it needs, but then close up during the day, not leach as much moisture, right?
Yeah.
But still have that CO2 that it would otherwise have to be open for. It has it, it's closed, it's storing it, then it can use it. That's pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, and there are a lot of plants that use CAM. Some of the ones that you're probably familiar with include pineapples and snake plants. And CAM is also something that plants can use either entirely or selectively. So there are quite a few plants that will use it as needed when required in order to reduce their evapotranspiration. Most cactus do it, and it's for this reason. A bunch of episodes ago, we were actually talking about how a couple of my European friends are worried about how I'm going to smother at night because I have so many plants in my bedroom, and they're telling me that those plants at night are taking in the oxygen that I need, and they're putting out CO2, so I might not have enough oxygen and I'll die in my sleep. So the plants that are often recommended for bedrooms are ones that use CAM, because this is their way of of breathing normally, they are producing oxygen during the nighttime period when most plants are not. And I actually want to have a specific episode where we talk about the process of photosynthesis and respiration in plants because it's really fascinating to me and I don't know enough about it. So
Yeah.
I want to dive more into this because there's a lot more to it than just CAM. And it's not just as easy as plants breathe in carbon dioxide and put out oxygen. It's a lot more complicated than that.
But this is still, it's still cool to think about. Like, your succulent plants maybe have this, little superpower that I was not quite aware of. And, many of us maybe grew up just seeing plants in the yard or, at least in temperate climates, like maybe a vegetable garden, right? Where, if there's a lot of sun, your plants may wilt during the day, or sometimes you were told, oh, don't water them during the day, or don't water at certain times. That's going to, sort of make too much moisture leach out of them, as their stoma are open or something. And as I'm saying this, I'm not sure if this is correct or not.
I think
this
that a
is
lot
kind
of
my
things get
childhood
said
memory.
that are like based on old
Yeah.
wives' tales.
But okay, yeah, maybe that's what that is. But it's cute. It's interesting to think about this superpower, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really cool because most succulents do this, and a lot of them do it as their exclusive means of breathing.
Okay, so we've been mentioning cacti in the same breath as succulents for the most part so far, but how are they different? Or would you separate these in all cases, or what?
Okay, so that's actually a really good point because Cactaceae is a family of plants where most species are succulent, but there's at least 25 other plant families that also contain multiple examples of succulent plants. So because this is more an adaptation for survival than a shared family characteristic, because it appears many times across plants in many families, in many regions, in many ecosystems.
Like we've said, yeah.
Yeah, like for most succulent species, you're not including cactus when you just say succulents, because typically somebody will say cacti if they're talking about them. Or they might say, succulents and cactuses. The truth is, most succulents are not cactus. Most cactus are succulents. And I want to mention like one cactus genus in particular that's really an oddball that probably very few of our listeners are familiar with. It is Pereschia. And Pereschia it's a true cactus. It's in the cactus family, but you would never know that by looking at it. It has almost woody, kind of vining, scrambling stems. And it does have the classic like cactus defining areoles, which are like those little nodes where you'll get spines, little white bristly hairs. But they also produce true actual leaves, just like regular foliage plants. They're very soft and tender, but they are indeed succulent. And what makes this cactus so interesting is that it is kind of being considered by taxonomists and botanists as being an example of an early evolved cactus. So it's kind of like a proto-cactus. It has all the things that you expect in like the floral structure, and it has the spines that are classic, but because it has leaves, it'll grow kind of as a vine or as a shrub.
You have one in your house, right?
Yeah.
Which species do you have?
I believe that I have Aucklandia,
Okay.
and it's like a special cultivar of it where it's not variegated per se. There are some variegated ones, but this one, the mature leaves that have been around for a while, they're like a bright kind of like lime green. It's a very bright kind of vivid color, and the new foliage grows in like a rosy pink.
Yeah, it's an
sometimes
interesting,
gold. Yeah,
interesting look.
it's really beautiful. I've never had it bloom because I've not given it bright enough sunlight and encouraged it to get large enough. It is one of the biggest magnets for mealybugs.
Really?
Well, the new growth is very tender. And because it
Alright.
doesn't have like the waxy, tough cuticle that you find on some of the other cactus species, I think that the mealybugs just think it's a true delicacy. So I've pruned it back heavily a few times when it's been infested. I've treated it with some systemic sprays and stuff. They're pretty under control, but I'm doing what I can to keep the plant a little on the sad side so that it doesn't just grow massive,
Oh.
because they definitely have that tendency. Instead, I'm watering it when it gets a little bit droopy, and it's really, really beautiful with the different colored leaves all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So are these easy to find, just out of curiosity?
No, they are something that you can easily find on eBay, I
Okay.
think. I bought mine at the Indoor Sun Shop.
Oh, all right.
I've only seen it there maybe 2 or 3 times in the years that I've been a customer there.
Okay.
Maybe I just show up on all the days that they're sold out. But it's not a plant that you'll find regularly. You can find it if you want to. Probably not in person, probably not at, definitely not at Home Depot.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is a cool example of how succulents takes place over like a gradation. This shows like an early evolved version of what has become the cactuses that we are very familiar with. But to go back to what you started asking, cactus are succulents, but like we don't usually group them in because they're usually
Yeah.
just called cacti.
Yeah, I feel like that's true in my own experience, right? If I were to say succulents, it wouldn't I mean, it would include cacti, but I
Yeah.
feel like
If you were talking about
I
cacti,
would
you would
make
say
it,
cacti.
yeah, I would make it that much more specific.
Yeah.
Just so that people are know what I'm talking
And I
about.
think that's true of a lot of horticulturalists too, because you'll often see the phrase like succulents and cacti, because
yeah.
they're aware that those are both like related, but yeah. So for most succulent species, they've basically evolved in areas with really high heat and low rainfall. But like I talked about before with the shallow roots, there are some species that rely entirely on mist and dew that forms during the night when it becomes much cooler. And that is enough to provide them with the hydration that they need when there isn't any measurable precipitation. And so Lima, Peru is actually an area that does not get annual measurable rainfall.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Wow.
like it's coastal, but its proximity to a lot of the kind of geography in the area mean that these really like moist clouds of marine air, they just have like this gray overcast morning that burns off and becomes bright sunny in the afternoon oftentimes. But a lot of the plants that are there natively survive entirely on the dew that forms. And in fact, it's so heavy, like the humidity is so high at night, even though it like straight up doesn't rain, that if you just stand outside after midnight, you'll get wet. And so there are plenty of succulents that have found ways to deal with such meager resources.
Very interesting. Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, some plants survive really well because they get like annual monsoons, like the Sonora Desert and the saguaro and everything. But these are all plants that are pretty tough because they've had to endure some of the toughest ecosystems that do not offer like the plant family a lot of success most of the time. So we've spent a lot of time kind of defining like what succulents are and aren't and how you can group them in different ways. But there are some varieties that are like those classic ones that we've talked about. So if we're thinking like the rosette forming succulents that a lot of people call hens and chicks, the hens and chicks genus is actually Sempervivum. Sempervivum?
I feel like we've had this same kind of stumble before.
Someday Miles
Not
will
that
tell
I'm
us
keeping
how to
track,
say
but-
this word. But that is also known as house leek, and it's a common outdoor plant in this area. It does really well outdoors. Indoors, you're probably going to encounter Echeveria. And there's a lot of varieties of these. They're one of the
Yeah.
most popular ones that you're going to find anywhere. Aeonium is similar. You'll sometimes see those called like tree house leeks because of their similarity to Sempervivum. They will grow taller, woodier. They have slightly thinner leaves. Now, there's also some that initially begin to look like a rosette, but then with age, they grow almost as like a trailing vine. So these include Haworthia, the multitude of sedums. There are many
There's
that are...
so many sedums.
Oh
right?
my gosh, yeah, like-
there's a lot of all of these.
Well,
but
they're
I think
native all over the
particularly sedum.
world, and the sedum you
Yeah.
can grow in your garden down to like climate zone 4, I bet, or lower. There are some that you want to keep indoors because they're frost sensitive.
Yep, there's a few in the mountains here that we see all the time on hikes.
Yeah.
And Haworthia, that's also called zebra plant, right?
Yeah.
I've heard that. Or maybe that's a particular kind of Haworthia.
I think it's a particular species, and to be honest, I'm not very familiar with it, but I am familiar with the zebra plant. You probably are too. It's very dark green, but it has these raised white, kind of like bumpy nodules that form zebra stripes on them. And when you get them when they're young, they're usually in a small pot. There's like a tight little kind of almost pine cone looking growth. But if you give them enough time, they'll grow into like a vine, and they'll get little side shoots, and they'll bloom like long spikes that have tiny flowers on them. Years after you've planted one, you might have one that's just like hanging all over the outside of your pot. It's really beautiful. But that's true of like these other ones as well, like the sedums. If you're looking for some that are just vines without having to wait years, these include the senecio, which is like the string of pearls, string of bananas. Those are really popular right now. The ceropegia, which is one of my favorites. It's the string of hearts. And then there's also crassula. And crassula is a large genus, and it involves like a lot of different growth forms. Some of them are shrubby, like the jade plant. Others are trailing. Some of them form more vines. There's just a lot of variety to be had in those. Then when you go and look at some of the ones that are more like fan-shaped, like the aloes, they may present in a rosette, but with longer leaves. Then there are many species that are succulent in genuses that aren't primarily succulent. So those can include like the euphorbia, the peperomia, pileas, kalanchoe. How do you say that word?
I say kalanchoe.
Kalanchoe. Yeah, this is
like he's politely asking me, like, you know, I'm the authority or something. But yeah, I think it's kalanchoe.
I'm pretty sure that Stephen's right.
I'm trying to not be, you know, imperious about this or something.
But
like
I'm feeling really self-conscious
a
because
tyrant about it.
I've never really liked kalanchoe. And so I never properly learned the word. I just know how it looks when I read it in my head on paper.
Okay, and I'll just say, honestly, I think it was kalanchoe is the first succulent that I really liked, actually. Mother of Thousands, a weird,
which is actually
one.
Bryophyllum. This is the hill I will die on. Oh, it is actually Bryophyllum.
But we may not be talking about the same one.
We may not, but the classic Mother of Thousands. Yeah, now...
Okay, sorry, Mother of Thousands is also like a term like succulent, I'm finding, which is like, it could
There's
mean
a lot
one
of
15 plants.
Yeah, like night-blooming cereus.
Depending on, you know, your region.
Yeah, like there are so many plants that share common names, it's ridiculous. Now, there's also a bunch of plants that are considered succulents that I probably wouldn't myself because they have more fibrous leaves. And those include agave, yucca, the ZZ plant, Hoya, Sansevieria. Like, these are fleshy plants for sure. But a lot of them have a lot more kind of cellulose fiber in their leaves. And they don't have that same kind of, like, fleshiness that you would associate with a jade plant, perhaps. But they're typically considered succulents. And these are also... not all, but most of the species and varieties that you're likely to encounter. And it probably covers most of the ones that you're going to be considering succulents. We did mention some like lithops, like there's a ton of like really cool ones that fall into these categories, but are at least related to the ones that we've talked about.
Okay, so what makes these the same care-wise? When we think about that, I think they typically require higher light, typically less water. I would give them a well-draining soil more than I would for many other species. That's kind of where I go with that. How about you?
Well, I think that it's pretty convenient to group the majority of these in the same cultural conditions because just like you said, very few of them come from areas with low light. So you're almost universally going to want to give them the brightest light that you can. Some of them may prefer indirect light, but none of them will do well in shade. Like, there are some sedum that you can grow in, like, woodlands and stuff. But for the most part, these want very, very bright light, or they're not going to grow much. And at worst, they'll actually, like, get all stretched out and tall looking for it. Just like you said, the coarsest draining potting mix. There are, obviously, some exclusions to these criteria.
Sure.
But I think for the most part, you want to give them a gritty, well-draining mix. You want to water them generously when they're in active growth in the warmest months, but you want them to dry out slightly between waterings.
Well, I would say more than slightly, right? Like, I think they should dry out, like, their pots should not be wet at all, right?
So this is an interesting point because we're going to present two sides to a debate. Some cactus and succulent growers want the pot to be 100% dry between waterings. Some succulents require that, but I think that for a lot of them, they can tolerate much more water than you would typically expect if your mix is like really gritty, really loose, really airy, because they want to have roots that are exposed to air, that aren't stagnant. And I think if you have picked the right potting mix, you're going to get some of your best flowering and some of your best growth, especially off of like the tropical looking flowers of cactuses. They're going to want the water to make that possible. So it's always this little thing of like, am I using clay pots to facilitate fast drying? Am I keeping them in a bright, very sunny, very warm spot to facilitate rapid drying? Have I used the grittiest mix possible so that the roots aren't sitting in water? Great. So then I can water it like every few days just before it's like completely dry and you'll get amazing growth.
So, yeah, I don't mean to disappoint you. I think we are agreeing, actually.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah. So I think for me, what I was reacting to is I'm like, well, okay, water generously and don't necessarily wait for it to dry out. Oh, yeah, I guess I'm not necessarily like checking every inch of this, to make sure it is bone dry, but I am facilitating that right by having, at least from my own kind of succulent growing, typically I'll have a really minerally mix, like
it's
certain
mostly
older,
sand and pumice.
kind of for
Yeah.
older plants, like you'll pick up the plant to water it maybe, and the soil will kind of move around because it's just like a bowl of grit, right?
Yeah.
At least at the top. But it's like, Matthew's saying, then you can water these more. Like, I think it helps to think about this like, rain in the desert, right? Rain in the desert's not a sprinkle, right? Or, it can be.
Sometimes
whatever,
it's
but,
just dew like we
but
discussed.
yeah, but I feel like it's, more often it's this gushing rain, there's a rainy season or something.
Like
It's getting
floodplains.
drenched. And then, like in a sandy environment, the water's just all going away right away. So I'm trying to mimic that.
Yeah. Now, and this is also one of those cases of what does the plant prefer versus what does the plant endure in real life outdoor garden space. So as long as you are just paying attention to not letting the roots stay super wet for a long period of time, I think you're going to be good. Now, I don't want to get into all of the like exceptions to these rules, but because succulents have such a strong ability to suck up as much moisture as they have available, there are some succulents like the lithops plant, which is also called living stones, and they straight up look like stones. And they come from an area in Africa that gets so little water that if you water these plants more than like 2 times a year, they will actually explode. Like, they will suck up so much water that they will, like, pop.
Yeah, I made a face when he said stones. I think they look like little butts.
Well,
Okay.
they look like 2 little stones arranged to look like 2 little...
Just
like a little
perfectly
butt.
like a little butt.
Yeah.
And listen, like, I don't hate these plants or something. It's coming across like that.
I
maybe.
love them.
I like them enough, but like not enough to own them.
Yeah.
Actually, but yeah, they're very interesting plants.
Yeah. But again, that's an outlier. Most of these plants are going to do really well if you just give them the brightest, sunniest windowsill, and if you just water them when they're regularly growing consistently. For the winter months, though, When they are not actively growing, when the temperatures are lower, I will let them get bone dry for a while before I give them any water because they're adaptable enough to survive that. And you risk rotting them the most when it's cold, when it is not very bright, and when they are not growing because they're not using that water.
And I would agree to that. I would say that I don't let them get bone dry, but I will have their watering. I
Yeah.
mean, easily.
Yeah, and I think that as you get more used to succulents, you'll also kind of learn what your individual plants tolerate
Yeah.
and what they respond well to. And yeah, clay pots are great.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So now that we, just said that succulents kind of means everything, but isn't really any, particular thing. What do you lean toward in succulents, Matthew?
Okay, so putting my mind space in now this is like the home grower slash horticultural conception of succulents. The ones that I really like are the ones that have amazing flowers.
Oh my gosh, we're so different. Okay.
Yeah, so this is...
That was not even in my multiple choice in my head, okay?
Any of our longtime listeners will know that Steven just is not into the blooms on his plants. He likes weird, interesting forms. And sure, I like that too. I think that a cool, gnarled-looking succulent is amazing. But I look for a couple of things specifically. I want a plant that is going to look really beautiful as it ages. So I really like the Echeveria and the sedums because if I plant them in a clay pot that'll tolerate for years down the road, it'll be spilling over the sides.
Yeah.
The stems that used to have the thick rosettes of leaves will now be bare and just the tips will have the leaves. They'll have a whole bunch of little additional offshoots and stuff.
Yeah, it will have crawled into every nook and cranny, looking for soil or water or it's
Yeah.
I get what you're saying.
And I think that that's also the kind of plant that makes a statement because you usually can't just go buy a plant like that. That is a sign that you have had that plant and you have grown and cared for it. And that makes it more personal to me than just a little dish that I've planted up of succulents that I got into pots at Home Depot. Those are great too, and they'll turn into that with age, but I really prize the longevity of these plants, so I like things that show that off. The ones that have amazing blooms, though, to me, there is nothing quite like a cactus flower. They are so delicate, and they're so papery. They almost look like they're made of tissue paper.
Yeah.
And for something that comes in such a harsh climate, it's this spectacular juxtaposition of delicate, obscene beauty in this arid, hostile climate. So that's really neat. And there's a genus of cacti called Echinopsis that to me are some of the best because they have really cool, round, barrel-shaped cactus form. Some of them have spines. A lot of the ones that you find don't. But they have humongous flowers. And what's really cool is when you get multiple flowers on the same plant because they tend to open together and they open at night. So these flowers, unlike orchids, which come from areas with really specialized pollination adaptation where they can't rely on being pollinated immediately, their flowers last for weeks and sometimes months. Cactus are I got this. There are bats and bees that will pollinate me. So they expend tons of resource into producing these amazing flowers that last less than a day. That's not true of all of them. Some cactus have flowers that last longer, but a lot of them will bloom just for one day or just at night. And my favorite group of cacti are the tropical epiphytic ones. And we're going to have a special episode just about these, but they're also called orchid cactus. And they're a total outlier when it comes to a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
They want to stay a lot more moist. They want much higher humidity. They don't want the very bright light. So we're going to focus on that outlier another time. But I think the last thing that I look for in succulents that I want to mention is I really like when they have beautiful structural architectural shape to them, and that's so many succulents. I feel like that's just true of succulents across the board. So those are all things that attract me to them. I've already touched a little bit on what attracts you to succulents, but I want to hear it in your words.
So for me, I think it's just that final part that you mentioned. For me, it's, interesting woody forms. For me, when I'm buying one, typically I will look for one that looks kind of distressed. Honestly, like something that looks
like prime state. It looks distressed.
Getting from the shop, and I'm like, whoa, this one has had it. I mean, maybe it was stepped on. It was at the corner. It was reaching for some light. So I feel like it already has a really interesting look, or it will look windswept. It will look like it's working hard, kind of. I think those are interesting, and those kind of transport me maybe to, where they're actually from a little bit.
Like the deserts of like Namibia.
Yeah, I think it kind of will convey some of that harshness or some of this resilience or something that I think is interesting about them. I will tend to not buy ones that are perfectly symmetrical, and this was definitely, got all of the water that it needed at all times and looks, I think for me that's just kind of not what succulents are about, right?
Yeah.
So I have several around my apartment that are kind of hanging off some, bit of pot, right? And they'll fill in eventually, but they have some weird, I think, aspects to them, or they'll have some dead chunks that, okay, maybe something is growing out of the side of that.
Yeah.
I think I like that about them. I do agree about the flowers for cacti. I think they are spectacular how they happen. I tend to think that some of the colors are a little bit highlighter, cloying, fake sometimes.
Well, most of the cactus flowers, if they're night blooming, they're white, and if they bloom during the day, they are yellow, orange, bright pink, or red.
Yeah, I'm okay with the red or the white. The yellow and the pink I'm less into, and I just think of the whole exercise of making, a cactus bloom as just sort of like arduous for everybody, including the plant, that I'm kind of like, okay, no, that's fine. You can keep your yellow highlighter thing, I don't hate it. I'm just not going to...
You're not going to go out of your way to affect it.
To
now,
make that happen.
For most of the cactus that I grow, it's just a treat when they bloom, and I don't focus my entire life on that happening. The orchid cactus, the epiphyllum, I will definitely go out of my way to make them flower.
Yeah,
Christmas cactus, I go out of my way to make them. But, for the most part, the enjoyment of the plant is not reduced if it's not flowering. It's still beautiful, so it's, just an additional little bonus if it does bloom.
So, Matthew, why do you think they're so popular, succulents? Why do we think they're so popular?
Well, I think that two things. One, just like we've been rhapsodizing, they're really beautiful. And I think that they offer something that is more sculptural and architectural. There's more dimension to a succulent than a lot of other plants. So I think that for a lot of people, the indoor kind of decor appeal is really strong. And I think that it is a specific aesthetic that you can nail in your apartment space by getting a really tall euphorbia, cactusy looking plant that'll tolerate your indoor conditions. You can't grow saguaro indoors, but I think that it calls to mind kind of that California South west corner of the United States. There's a specific vibe that gives. Then the alternative reason that I think also factors in, they have this reputation as just being really easy to care for.
See, I think it's more like that. Honestly, I think it's this marketing coup. I'm not even judging that, right?
But I'm totally picturing this girl named Melanie who lives in Los Angeles who wants to live her jungle girl California thing. So she knows that she travels a lot. And so it's this great combination of she doesn't have to water them when she's on an Instagram photo shoot in Jakarta, but when she comes home, she knows that she'll still have living plants that are gorgeous and make her feel
I don't mind Melanie, okay?
No, I kind of wish I was friends with her.
Tease her. Yeah.
Yeah, but follow us on Instagram, Melanie.
Yeah.
But it's that ease of culture that gets people.
Yeah, I think that has just been successfully marketed to people, right? And, no matter that probably your problem with growing plants before, it was probably overwatering, right? It was probably not underwatering. But they came to you and they said, "Oh, did you forget to water that plant last time? Okay, well, try this succulent. It's going to stay small." And then, I think we can all go around and read the directions for
Yeah.
these. It's actually very interesting. I was at Target, kind of a big box store in the US. I think most people know it. But I went there, saw some succulents in a box, and it was a closed box
Like a
without
terrarium?
drainage. Yeah, and this was a couple years ago. In fairness, maybe they're no longer there, but it said water every 2 weeks.
Well, we
And
have, yeah.
but I think what they did, they're trying to make it very simple. I think whatever, you can do this with a lot of plants, right? But I think that marketing part, right, saying, "Oh well, did you underwater? Do you think you underwatered? Well, try again now." I just think that's been successful.
Yeah. I think that this is a double-edged sword because people hear, oh, succulents are so easy. They're really tough. They're really resilient. So you don't need to water them. And then they have a plant that doesn't get watered enough and it withers away. Or they hear that they're really easy, but they don't think about the light component. So then, like, we've talked about this several times, but plants that stretch out to reach light are not happy, and succulents will do this. So I think that there are a lot of people who like plants and they like the concept of them, but then when it comes to having a plant and caring for it, they go with a succulent because they're like, I'm not a plant person. I just want something beautiful in my life. Then they put a beautiful aloe, like, in their bathroom where there's too much humidity and absolutely no light, and they water it every 2 weeks and it's not using any of that water, so it rots and it defoliates, and then they're left with this feeling of, I can't grow plants, I even kill succulents. And I want to challenge that because I think that it is a really great way to accidentally teach somebody that they're not good with plants when that's just not true. Like, the truth of it is succulents need a specific set of care requirements, and then they're easy. So once you've achieved them, it's really easy to keep your succulents happy, but without observing those few requirements,
Yeah.
I think that you can get somebody to really feel bad about their plant care ability.
You know, and I'll just add, they're so popular because they're so damn cheap now.
Well,
Okay?
they're really easy to propagate.
Yeah.
If you have a really beautiful sedum and you want more really beautiful
If
sedum,
you have a really ugly sedum, okay? If you find a chunk of an ugly sedum
Yeah.
on the subway,
the
you
aesthetic
could probably
value,
propagate it.
yeah, the aesthetic
mean-
value does not matter. You just take the leaves off and you do this gently so that you retain the whole entire intact leaf. And then you just set it on top of some lightly moist
Yeah.
soil, keep it fairly humid, and they grow
Really,
baby plants.
there are 8 billion YouTube videos about how to do this, but I think, people have done this, so there are all sorts of things now. I saw a succulent subscription service
Yeah.
that will send you, succulents. I don't know if it's like a couple a month.
There's
or
probably
what.
like different levels. You can
Oh yeah,
get,
but
like,
otherwise you can go to so many different stores and find some, at least around us, for probably $4, and that's,
Yeah.
I mean, you could find cheaper.
yeah, like
So-
2-inch succulents at Home Depot are like under $3. I
Anyway,
think.
yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly a good thing, honestly. People get several tries. There's
Yeah.
so many different forms that I think, people can like certain ones, but not others, and
Yeah.
they're great.
One of my favorite things to do, and I don't, so I'm the kind of plant person who I like all of my plants in their own individual pot, labeled with a scientific name, and I don't do like arranged plantings often because I just don't have the space for it, to be honest. But I do this with succulents. I take like a shallow clay dish and I pick out a variety of succulents where you'll have like a thriller, a filler, and a spiller. Like one.
Oh my god.
Steven's rolling his eyes.
Wow.
The thriller is like a tall, beautiful plant. The filler are the ones that sit around it to give it some context, and the spiller is the one that falls over the sides. And I'll do this with succulents where I'll pick like a half dozen of them, arrange them, put some beautiful stones and gravel and sand around them. And every time that I do this, I am always counting on a couple of the plants to die. not counting on. I always expect a couple plants to die. That always seems to happen
Yeah.
for me. But
See, that's why I
then,
don't do that because I think you read that about a lot of these plants. It's like, all right, does not something like does not like to share pots, does not like competition for different,
yeah.
I mean, so
But over
okay,
time, like if you're successful with your plant
yeah,
selection,
yeah.
and even if you're not, the rest of them will fill in that space. And so then you just have these pretty little planters that have all these different succulents like competing for resource.
So
Yeah, but
so go on.
I had no thought.
So then your favorite, like, what is your favorite succulent in your collection? I assume it's going to be a thriller. I was going to say.
Well, all my plants are thrillers. Okay, you asked a question that I don't have a clean answer. Conceptually, like
Conceptually, I made a
conceptually,
face.
yeah.
Okay.
I think that our viewers could feel your face.
Okay.
So I've talked about this plant before too. I'm so sorry. Piniocereus gregii. It
I
is
am shocked by this answer.
well. So
Interesting.
the reason that
I mean, I'm on board with it.
Yeah.
I like it. I just think you okay.
the reason I'm going to pull this out as conceptually my favorite succulent in my collection is because it has spectacular flowers that I am probably not going to see for a long time. And I have not unlocked the key to getting it to grow really strong yet. I think that it comes down to the amount of heat that I'm able to give it.
I was going to say that too. Heat
Yeah.
and light, probably, right?
Well, it's in an east-facing, unobstructed window, so it gets a good amount of direct sunlight. But in the Sonora Desert where they're native, they don't like full sun. They actually grow like in
Kind of
shrubs.
under stuff.
Yeah, and this is because if left to their own devices, they don't stand upright well. They'll grow upright, but then they'll fall over, and then they'll kind of become like a snaking, vining thing. And they keep trying to grow up, but then they keep like falling back down because they just don't have the support. But if they're growing under shrubs, they can use the shrubs as scaffolding, and it protects them from the sunlight. They have it's not really a green plant. It is just like a stick that comes out of the soil that'll branch with age. And it has 4 ribs, so it's like a 4-sided plant. And it has like really tight little small kind of like spines
It's very
that
beautiful
curl.
spines. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a plant that you're going to stick yourself on the way that other plants do. But it's almost like a dark purpley gray color, kind of silvery. It's just a really interesting plant, and I have it in a pot that I think really like kind of accents the shape. And what I want to do is to put like an incandescent grow light over it, because incandescent is
Yeah.
not the best choice for grow lights because they produce a lot of heat for very little light output. However, in this case, I want it to have heat and I don't need it to be like scorched in the sun. So I just need to find a way to make this plant happy enough, because when it blooms, they're spectacular. They all sync up in a region so that they all bloom at the same time. And it's one of the probably hundreds of species of cactus called night blooming cereus. They all have white flowers. I'm going to have a party when this one blooms eventually one day. They're intoxicatingly fragrant by all accounts. And
Wow.
it's just a neat plant. And it's a North American native. It's native to the Sonora Desert. I think that if I was going to mention like just my favorite plant that I have, though, it's the Echinopsis that I talked about in our first episode that my grandmother bought me when I was like 3.
Okay.
As a you just learned to use the toilet potty training gift.
He's still proud about that moment.
I'm real proud. Yeah, no accidents for this boy. But this cactus is, like Stephen was saying, like it looks like it has been stepped on over time. Like it has marks on it
I
from...
haven't seen this, have I?
No, but you were talking about how you love plants that looked all like...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Now I want to see this one. That's okay. Anyway,
Okay, yeah, I will show you the next time that you're over. It's in a really bright spot on my balcony, which means that you can't see it from sitting on my balcony. But yeah, like, it's just a great plant because I've had it for almost 30 years, and I feel really attached to it. Yeah, succulents are fantastic. Of course, I just named 2 cactuses, so let me actually round that out. My third, let me just keep talking.
So the one favorite, we're now at favorite number 3.
My third favorite is the jade plant because
Oh.
it's really plain, it's really common. You see them everywhere. I have 2 cultivars of it. One of them is just like the standard green jade plant. That plant, however, it's a really large bushy plant that I have. And I started that from a really small cutting when I was in middle school. And I got that cutting from my aunt, who had a similarly large plant that she grew from a cutting that she got from one of her like cohort members when she was in grad school at the university. So
Wow.
like this plant is just like the cutting plant that everybody has a copy of. Several of my good friends have them. And I also have a variety that's called Gollum. And it has, instead of like the flat, fleshy paddle-shaped leaves, they've almost formed a little tube. So there's kind of like a little like divot on the top end. And that one grows less vigorously, and it's very prone to mealybugs because it has so many like tight little areas that
I've
an
seen
insect
this one.
can get.
It's kind of a strange one, I think.
I actually really like it. And
Yeah, people love it. My mom
Yeah.
has this and loves it. I mean, to me, it's very like it's sort of plan of the moment. A couple years ago, I would say again.
Yeah, but I've had mine for like longer than that.
Yeah, I'm not saying you got that, but I feel like I saw a ton of them a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
You'll usually find them in small sizes because it is slower growing than the one that you're going to encounter more regularly. So it's a fairly small plant. I have it growing in a 6-inch pot. And it started in a 2-inch pot like maybe 5 years ago. But it's just cool and it's really dependable. It tolerates kind of excessive watering without rotting. It tolerates low watering without dying. The one thing that you have to be careful about with them is that when they are very, very large and you put them in a larger pot and the roots haven't grown in and reestablished, you don't want to water them. Because one time I actually repotted my mother plant and watered it heavily to get it settled in, and it just started rotting in the roots, and I recognized it early enough that I was able to just like cut off all the growth above the soil and then root it and grow it like as cuttings. I was really fortunate about that. I definitely would have had propagation material, but the plant lost about half of its size in that. So it's easy, but as long as you're thoughtful about the watering. But Steven, do you have like a dozen favorite succulents that you want to highlight?
I think I'm just going to mention my favorite. It's still this pseudolithos. I'm not completely sure on the species, actually. I got it, a seed-grown one, from someone at a garden shop. They think it was, something with an M. I'll keep talking about it while I look up the species name, but it's a really interesting one. It's from the Horn of Africa, I think like East Africa. And it just looks like kind of a dried up melon a little bit to me. It's just so strange looking, incredibly strange flowers.
It's a really pretty, like, soft jade green color, but it looks like an alien tumor.
Yeah, it just looks like an elephant skin sort of thing to me.
Yeah.
And I think just the form is so remarkable that, yeah, that just makes it interesting to me too. These have been, it's been said that these are difficult to grow. I think I am tantalized by that a lot of the time too. There were really conflicting directions about how to grow this when I got it, and I was lucky enough to, have one that was planted in perfect soil. I didn't actually plant it. And I had good conditions, like I had a warm grow shelf, and this stuff kind of worked out well. That mine's doing well, and it's about a year old, and it's getting really strangely shaped. It kind of just looked like a little finger before, but now it looks like some kind of swollen toe or something. I mean,
but so beautiful.
Yet it's appealing.
Yeah.
So I think that one is just probably the most remarkable one that I have, and it's the one that I, when I think sometimes about, gosh, if I can only, keep 5 of these plants, it's always on the list.
Even though it looks like you chewed up about 10 sticks of spearmint gum and then wadded it into some gravel.
I spat it out, and I walked away for 10 years and came back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now it's its own thing.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that cool euphorbia that you got recently. Is it like called Medusa Head or something.
Oh, this one. I'm actually going over to look and see what it's called. Decarii, I would say. Decarii. This is one that I actually saw at our local conservatory, Volunteer Park Conservatory in Seattle. They have a big mature plant that's kind of carpeted, part of their shelf. But I saw a little bit for sale at a garden shop nearby, so I got it. It looks like miniature trees, kind of incredibly rigid, succulent looking leaves, almost like a miniature palm or something.
The thing that's interesting about the leaves to me is that they kind of curl up over themselves a bit to make like a little canoe shape, but then all of the outside margins are deeply like wavy, and they're very stiff, they're very firm. As they age, they become brown. The new ones are a dark green. But I've seen these plants growing so that it just looks like a tangle of snakes.
Yeah, and it really looks like sort of a shield on the ground kind of thing. Like it creates a mini forest, I feel like.
Yeah, it's a neat plant. I imagine if I was the size of a tree frog, it would be really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any closing thoughts, Matthew?
Well, I just think that succulents are fantastic. And I have a little bit of this chip on my shoulder because when people say, like, I love succulents, I'm like, well, that's great. Are you including spinach in that? Because, like, spinach can be succulent.
Okay, now I'm distressed too.
Yeah, this is my, like, trying to right the world and trying to help people see that, like, you can't just say succulents and mean one little group of the houseplants that people love to grow. It's a survival adaptation. You could call orchids succulents because with their thick leaves and their pseudobulbs, they store moisture for times of drought. Bulbs do the same thing like hyacinth and daffodils, but those aren't succulents. So depending on the definition, they could be. I think it's so interesting, but this is a plant group that is not based in taxonomy. It's based in like different examples of the same adaptation appearing throughout evolution in many plant families.
So 90% of our episodes going forward will just be called succulents, okay?
Yeah.
Episode 12, succulents. Episode 13, succulents. And it's going to be about different things, all
Yeah,
right? So get used to it.
Yeah, succulents, semicolon, onions. Just going to talk about the alliums,
Yeah.
that famous succulent.
Plant Daddy succulent cast, okay, from here on out.
Yeah, but I think that it's a fantastic type of plant for a lot of home gardeners because if you're going to try to grow some plants but you like to travel, you really should be thoughtful about your selection, and these are good selections for that. I think that having a jungle aesthetic is beautiful indoors, and it's really easy to do, but you have to observe some things like the sunlight. And I think that a lot of people get tricked into thinking that they're bad with plants because succulents have a reputation as being like totally neglect proof and that you can't kill a succulent. And Brian, my boyfriend, likes to tell a story about how he like killed a cactus in Arizona when he was living there. And
Wow.
the way that he did that was he, I think, bought a cactus at a garden center and then just put it outside on their back south-facing porch when it got sunburned and died. So, like, you know, mileage may vary, but I would really like our listeners who don't feel like they have great luck with plants to not start with succulents unless they're willing to give them the sunlight, because I don't want people to think that they're bad with plants just because they had a hens and chick that exfoliated in their bathroom.
Yeah, so it's not the easiest miracle plant. That's true.
But it's going to do really well if you give them bright light, let their soil drain really well, and give them water when they want it, but not when they aren't using it.
Yeah, so that we can start there.
Yeah. And also, if you're afraid of asphyxiating in your bedroom because of how many like leafy foliage plants you have, get some of these because they use CAM.
So glad we cleared that up.
Yeah. But yeah, any thoughts that you have about succulents?
No, you know, I think even leaving this discussion, I will think about these slightly differently. You know, we do some preparation before we come to these, but yeah, having this full conversation, I, you know, am going to Google spinach after this for sure and see how succulent I think it is.
Well, I mean, like I said, succulents as an evolutionary tactic comes on kind of a spectrum. So if you grow spinach in a dry environment, it's going to look different than if you grow it in a wet environment.
I think that's a good closing thought.
It is. So spinach, everyone, your new favorite succulent. Yeah. Okay, well, this has been Plant Daddy Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to continue harassing everybody about liking and following and subscribing until, what was it, 100 million daily downloads? Is that our number?
That's bare minimum.
Yeah. So, like, we will lighten up on asking this of you once there's 100 million daily downloads. If you like what you've heard, please give us a 5-star rating. And we love it when you tell your friends. We've had several listeners reach out to let us know that a friend told them about us. So apparently that's a great way to get word around. If you want to be in touch with us directly, you can do so by emailing us at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com or check us out on social media, all of which can be found at Plant Daddy Podcast. We are looking forward to tuning in next time. Coming up, we are going to have an episode where we talk specifically about the tropical epiphytic cactuses because they are the outlier here and they are one of my favorites. So yeah, thank you for listening and happy growing.
Good luck growing your spinach.